All set to take off again. Kabul Airport reopens for domestic and aid flights. Many desperate Afghans now hope they'll start receiving international aid. But can Afghanistan's new rulers get the airport fully operational soon? And can the Taliban ensure the lifeline for millions is safe to use? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nastasia Tay. Now, reopening Kabul's international airport is critical for the Taliban if it's to stand a chance of rebuilding Afghanistan. The country is landlocked, damaged by decades of war, and its mountain ranges are difficult to cross. So the free and secure movement of people and goods is highly risky, even in normal times. Now, this fragile security situation poses a big challenge to making the airport fully operational again. Add to that the need for skilled manpower and new equipment. The airport is the gateway for international aid to reach millions of displaced people and a lifeline to reviving the economy. But with the first domestic flight taking off less than a week since the Americans left the facility in shambles, there is now some hope. Victoria Gatenby has this exclusive Al Jazeera report.
Afghans board an airplane at Kabul International Airport bound for the northern city of Mazar-e-Sharif. Technical teams have been working for days to repair the badly damaged runway and radar system, and on Saturday their efforts paid off. This is the first domestic flight from Kabul since it fell to Taliban forces last month, and airport staff say they're looking forward to more in the coming days.
We're very happy because the internal flights have started, and now we're taking our wages, and everything is going according to plan.
The reopening should soon allow Afghanistan to reconnect with the outside world and vital aid to get in. But the Taliban says more work needs to be done before the airport is fully operational again.
As you know, the airport was destroyed by the Americans. They burned down every part of it. Therefore, we needed time to repair it. But we predict that within a few days, international flights will be in progress.
Aviation experts say international airlines are unlikely to resume flights to Kabul until airport security is guaranteed.
It's going to take a lot of convincing and reassurance to have a foreign airline fly not just over Afghanistan, because overflight is off limits now too, but to Afghanistan. We're talking about aircraft that are insured by third-party companies and leasing companies that will say, no, airline, you are not able to take this aircraft there because we can't guarantee that it will get out in the state that we require it, and so on.
Thousands of people still want to leave Kabul, and the Taliban's leaders have promised they will be allowed. Some will see the gradual reopening of the airport as a sign they're keeping their word. Victoria Gatenby for Inside Story.
Well, let's talk a bit more about some of the security threats that may hamper Kabul Airport getting back on track. ISIL-K is currently the Taliban's main enemy on the ground there. The group carried out a suicide attack that killed at least 170 people near the facility during those last days of the American withdrawal. They also fired rockets towards the airport as the Taliban was then taking charge. The risk of missile attacks from ISIL-K is very real. And then there are also the rebels in Panjshir Valley who are resisting Afghanistan's new rulers. They're heavily armed and also able to disrupt flight operations. Well, let's now bring in our guests. From Florida, we have Keith Mackey. He is president of Mackey International. That's an aviation consultancy firm. In Berlin, Hans-Jakob Schindler, a senior director at the Counter-Extremism Project and a former coordinator of the ISIL, Al-Qaeda and Taliban monitoring team at the UN Security Council. And from Nairobi in Kenya, we have Eileen McCarthy. She's advocacy manager for the Norwegian Refugee Council in Afghanistan. She was recently evacuated. Thank you all for joining us. Now, as we've been saying, the airport has reopened to domestic flights, but there are obviously huge challenges to getting international flights up and running. I believe the airport is actually still operating without any kind of radar or navigation system. Keith, what's your assessment of the state of the airport at the moment? And as a pilot yourself, would you feel comfortable going down that runway?
Well, apparently they are operating without radar, which is indicated by the fact that the radar tracking kilograms show no aircraft overflying the country at all. That's not a safe operation, particularly if the weather is marginal. So that's going to have to be corrected before the airport becomes viable for international flights. There are many, many factors that need to be addressed before the country can resume full international flights in accordance with ICAO safety standards.
Well, we'll dig into some of those in a moment. There are obviously also huge security concerns around the airport, not to mention ongoing fighting that's not very far away. But Hans Jakob, I want to start by asking you if you feel that this reopening now was premature. Has there been enough time to evaluate the threats that exist? And we're now, I know, only talking about domestic flights, but obviously there are still threats.
Well, the reopening from the international flights is really important, as I'm sure my colleague from the Refugee Council will point out, because this is one of the primary in and out of the country for some very important emergency humanitarian relief. The situation in the country is far from stable. Obviously, you still have ISIS-K operating, as you have seen very tragically with the attack and the second attempt attack before the Americans left. But you also have quite a few al-Qaeda affiliates in the country, which are unfortunately still in a very close relationship with the Taliban, which is obviously a very bad security concern for anyone going in and out of this country. Al-Qaeda having targeted multiple times and very famously 9/11 by using commercial aircraft liners. That's really not to be a point of plus for the Taliban.
Indeed. Well, the priority, obviously, and the rush has really been, understandably, to try to get aid flights up and running. Eileen, can you discuss the significance of those, especially at a moment like this of such transition?
Yeah, so we have seen Afghanistan at the brink of a massive humanitarian crisis. I'm sure you and many others saw the heartbreaking scenes of Afghans desperate to get out. And we at the Norwegian Refugee Council are focused on the nearly 40 million Afghans who remain in the country, about half of whom are in need of humanitarian assistance. So the airport in Kabul is really critical to getting humanitarian personnel and aid supplies in the country. We've seen a bit of progress in other parts of the country, but given that so many of our operations are based out of Kabul, and that's where so many supplies and aid support was coming through the country, it's really critical to be able to have that going up and ready as soon as possible.
Of course, really critical to get not only goods, but people moving very safely around the country. I want to take a look at the geography of the airport, because that in itself is quite interesting. Now, surrounded by the Hindu Kush Mountains, Kabul's international airport has been the main gateway to Afghanistan since the 1960s. It's located on the outskirts, just north of the capital, that's home to more than 4 million people. The Taliban is obviously trying to establish security. The airport, though, is at a high altitude and has greatly expanded during the past 2 decades. It's now capable of housing more than 100 aircraft. Just 150 kilometers north, though, is the Panjshir Valley. Rebel fighters there have the ability to launch attacks towards the airport and potentially even threaten the airspace in the region. Hans Jakob, as we've been saying, fighting there not very far away at all. And also, as we were saying earlier, there were rockets actually launched at the airport in the last days of the American withdrawal. What's your reading of the situation, especially because I understand that those rockets, when they were launched, were defended by a US defense system, which is no longer there. What's your reading of the infrastructure now at the airport itself?
Well, I mean, the approach and departure from Kabul Airport was always a major security problem. The mountains reach very close, so you have to do a very drastic drop and therefore expose your aircraft to potential ground-to-air fires. That is definitely a security concern. I'm not 100% sure whether the people in the Panjshir Valley who are asking for international help would be the first ones to fire at international aircraft, potentially carrying aid. But obviously, you still have ISIS-K, who has absolutely no problems about shooting down international aircraft or killing any civilians. And then you have all of those al-Qaeda affiliates, and there is quite a number of them operating in the country, also not having any reservations about targeting international civilian aircraft.
Indeed. Well, in order to even run operations at the airport, you also need to be able to secure the facility. In order to do that, you need the capacity, the training to do that, not to mention being able to screen passengers and make sure that people are safe and fit to travel. Now, I see both Qatar and Turkey have been involved in the talks to do that, and Qataris are on the ground right there at the moment. Keith, I know that's a very, very big ask. Are you confident that the Taliban can actually handle it?
You're talking about international flights clearing the passengers going outbound?
Well, just being able to actually manage the capacity of handling the airport facility itself.
Well, while the airport has the capacity of parking 100 airplanes, they probably can't use it all because a lot of them are probably in remote locations. So it depends on how they wish to do it. They're going to have a security program that comports with international standards. Otherwise, we'll have the possibility of boarding a terrorist on a flight out of Kabul who could go anywhere in the world. So the security is going to be a very serious issue before the airport's able to operate in a normal international environment.
Well, Keith, just in terms of the operations, though, like actually running the airport, things like the radar when that's actually reinstalled, air traffic control, what would be your priorities here in terms of training the people who need to run the airport?
Well, the controllers in the tower are going to be the most important to get up and running first. The equipment's probably already there, unless it was removed in the withdrawal. We'll need people that know how to use the equipment properly. If they're not there, they'll have to be trained. Probably expatriates will run the show for at least the immediate future until more people, local people, can be brought online. But all this is going to be very important. The interface with the radar system to be able to properly separate and monitor overflying aircraft. The instrument approaches into the airport will have to be monitored because the airport is at a high elevation, such a mountainous area. They're not easy approaches. And when the weather isn't good, they'll become absolutely necessary for the airport to be operational at all.
Keith, you were mentioning there 100 planes that can be accommodated at the airport. I mean, that doesn't sound particularly large, especially when you're taking into account aid flights as well as potentially some military flights and the commercial flights that need to resume. Eileen, we know the needs in Afghanistan are huge. Does the airport have the capacity to meet them?
I think that's a good question. I'm not an aviation expert, but definitely the needs across the country are massive. And I think Kabul, the airport there, is indicative of also the situation at airports across the country. We need to be able to move things not only into Afghanistan, but around the country. That includes humanitarian assistance and supplies. It also includes our staff to be able to go support our comrades who are working across the country. We operate in about half of Afghanistan's provinces, and previously we had been able to move on commercial flights as well as UN-facilitated flights, and being able to get that up and running in order to be able to get those supplies where they need to be, to where men, women, boys, and girls are in need, and to where our colleagues are working really hard to get our programs back up and running, will be critical so that we can actually scale up the humanitarian response that's needed right now. We're seeing the winter months coming and are keenly aware that the humanitarian needs will continue to rise over the coming months, where access is extremely challenging and the situation on the ground for people is changing on a day-to-day basis. They might be moving home after having been displaced. They might be displaced once again by the ongoing drought. So our ability to be able to operate across the country and make sure that supplies are consistently coming in and that prices aren't rising for things like food or other humanitarian supplies that are really critical to people right now.
Of course. Well, as Eileen was saying there, it's not just about the airport itself. It's obviously also about the flight routes, getting people and goods in and out of the airport. Hans Jakob, I see in your counterterrorism work, you've also built partnerships with the International Civil Aviation Organization and IATA, the International Air Transport Association. Now, given the ISIL-K threat that you've been talking about, as well as the various other groups and the ongoing fighting that we're seeing, do you think there are actually safe routes in and out of Kabul for planes?
Well, that is a question of what kind of definition you put on for safe. If you're talking about ICAO rules at the moment, no, because we have an unclear relationship on how the Taliban are going to handle the threat from ISIS-K, how they're going to handle the threat from Al-Qaeda, fighting in between the Taliban factions, as well as their relationship with Al-Qaeda. So there are numerous security concerns at the moment. Plus, of course, there are quite a few technical concerns. They need to be able to receive and transmit API and PNR data, which is passenger information that is used for terrorism, and they would need to check against those before letting anyone enter their country. That too is by no means guaranteed. Until very recently, this was done by the Olive Group, a security contractor from Great Britain. I'm not quite sure if they're willing to renew their contract with the Taliban at this point, but I doubt it.
Sure, plenty of uncertainty there. Now, I was looking at a map of air traffic today in the region, like literally today, and the airspace over Afghanistan is very noticeably empty. Keith, presumably, as we've been talking about here in terms of safe flight routes, there are financial implications for carriers if they're wanting to use Afghanistan's airspace, so if they're choosing to fly around the country rather than over it. And presumably also, as we heard in our report, there are insurance costs for airlines who are wanting to fly in and out of Kabul. Is it realistic to think that that's not going to be prohibitive for many carriers?
Well, yes, it is a difficult situation. Each country is entitled to charge airlines for overflight. And the flight routes, particularly from Europe to the Far East, are dependent on weather and wind conditions to find the most optimum routes. And many of these, of course, would go across the country. And if they're not permitted to be used by the various aviation agencies, in the U.S., the FAA has banned all overflights and in and out operations for Afghanistan until things are settled down, and I'm sure that quite a few of the European countries are doing the same thing. Hence the lack of air traffic crossing the country on radar. But this will, of course, have to be corrected as time goes on when they can be assured that the flights can overfly safely without fear of being shot down or other interference from the Taliban or other terrorist groups in the area.
And we still obviously don't know when those assurances can come. I mean, all of this is making Afghanistan look more and more isolated. So much of all of this is about perception and confidence building, and the airport really feels like a very big symbol of that. Eileen, how critical is it in terms of not only ensuring aid in practical terms, in terms of getting aid moving around the country, but also in terms of ensuring actual funding, both from countries and international organizations and UN bodies, to actually get humanitarian aid into the country? How important is the airport itself just as a symbol here of where the country's going?
Definitely. I think what we've seen over the past few weeks is that the Kabul airport is the perspective that so many around the world have of the situation in Afghanistan, and especially the situation in Kabul. I know, especially in recent days, if we've seen the situation somewhat calm down, even the anxiety and stress of our staff who are based in Kabul has been slightly calmer. But I think, as you pointed to, the willingness and understanding of the world and its commitment to responding to the humanitarian crisis, and also in our ability to be able to deliver that aid, I think will be really critical. So while we're calling for donors to fast-track humanitarian support and make sure that we are able to get supplies into the country, I think having a stable and functioning international airport in Kabul will help to allay some of those fears and concerns that they have in our ability to actually meet those needs. And it will obviously enable us to do so that much better and that much quicker, which is really critical in the next few weeks and months.
Of course. Well, there's obviously a huge learning curve ahead, and the airport is really just one aspect of that. Hans Jakob, I want to talk about the stability of the country. There have been lots of promises made around inclusive government, coherent governance. There are obviously divisions within the Taliban and multiple groups involved, as you alluded to. If the Taliban will live up to its promises, do you think that, are you confident that this will happen and that the situation will stabilize?
Well, I mean, so far we haven't seen much inclusivity from the Taliban, apart from saying that they want inclusivity. So obviously the jury is still out, but I'm getting increasingly doubtful that there will be an inclusive Afghan government. There are, of course, several layers of sanctions that are relating to Afghanistan and the Taliban in the United Nations Security Council, one specific regime towards the Taliban, and then the Al-Qaeda-ISIL regime, which applies to the Taliban because of their relationship with Al-Qaeda. And then, of course, the US government has broadly sanctioned the Taliban quite a number of years ago, including the Taliban as a movement. All of this makes it very hard to engage. I have heard, of course, and everyone else has, some overtures towards Russia and China, from the Taliban spokesperson telling that China is now their most important ally. I'm sure Pakistan was quite amazed hearing this, given the history of the Taliban with Pakistan. But even Russia seems to have not really complete confidence in its potential new partners, because they're conducting one after the other military exercise in Central Asia at the northern border of Afghanistan. So there too, I guess, there are still some question marks that need to be answered.
Of course, and this is a huge learning curve, especially in terms of infrastructure as well, not just in terms of the politics of governance, but also in terms of actually running a country, running a capital, running this airport. Keith, I'm curious, how soon do you think we could see the airport fully operational, especially with the level of cooperation we're now seeing from various other countries in terms of training, for instance?
Well, I think it's going to be a while. I don't think the airport will be fully operational for international flights anytime in the near future. There's just too many things that have to be done, particularly the passenger security, the ability to screen people, the other controller functions. I think it's going to be a while before it's back to normal.
Eileen, I want to leave the last answer here to you, because I know the Norwegian Refugee Council is working very hard on trying to get aid and your own staff back into the country. You yourself were evacuated. As you alluded to earlier, you mentioned there is a drought. There's obviously a pandemic, huge concerns about food insecurity at the moment. What are the most immediate needs for the Afghan people now as we face this very unstable situation?
Yeah, I think there are any number of needs that Afghans require in the coming weeks and months. One of them is ensured safety and protection by whomever is in charge, and ensured that there is the protection of civilians and a willingness to uphold international humanitarian law and human rights law across the country. What we also need to see is this delivery of urgent humanitarian assistance and funding, and the ability to operate across the country. We have operated in government and non-government controlled areas for years, and negotiating humanitarian access for men and women, boys and girls, in no matter where they are, will be critical. So we need to be able to deliver as humanitarian partners who have committed to staying in the country and delivering this necessary humanitarian assistance. And we really need the international community and the local authorities to be able to facilitate and enable that. As I mentioned, there is a drought ongoing. A third of Afghans are food insecure. And with the winter coming, they'll need safe shelter and blankets, access to humanitarian assistance. Children need to get back to school. So we're really conscious that we don't have months to wait and really need to be hitting the ground now.
Hans Jakob, I saw you nodding there, so I'll let you come in there just on that one. In terms of stability and the way that the country is moving forward, I know you've expressed your own doubts about where the country is right now. Do you think that the immediate humanitarian needs that Eileen's just outlined there will actually be met? Presumably there is the international political will to do that. Is there actually the practical situation on the ground to allow that to happen?
Well, at the moment, it's still a great challenge. Obviously, humanitarian aid is never part of any sanctions, not by the UN, not by the US, not by the European Union, but the operational aspects, getting financial transfers done, getting material in and out of the country, are always a challenge. At the moment, we just saw 2 weeks of zero liquidity flow in and out of the country. It's getting a little bit better now, but we are nowhere near that we could say that this cash-based economy is supplied with the liquidity it needs to just barely survive. So this will remain a challenge. What I know is that there is goodwill both in the Security Council, on the American side, on the European side, and many other member states to make this easier. But the Taliban, having taken power and not broken with one of the global leading terrorist organizations in the world, will make it very hard for decision makers in any capital to decide beyond the bare minimum of what may be possible.
Well, we'll see how it all plays out in the coming days and weeks and months. Thank you to all of our guests, Keith Mackey, Hans Jakob Schindler and Eileen McCarthy. And thank you too for watching. Remember, you can see this program again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also always join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nastasia Tay, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.